Welcome to the Animal Free Labcast, everybody, on this very hot and sticky week. I am back with Dr. Gemma Davies. Hiya, Gemma. What have we got coming up today?
Today we are going to be joined by our Director of Public Affairs, Isabel Martin, and she's going to give us a bit of a roundup of our Herbie's Law progress so far this year before the government goes off to recess over the summer in July.
Well, before we talk with Isabel, though, tell us the results of last week's Myth or Fact. Sorry, I should stop doing that. So the question, or the myth or fact, was alternatives to animal testing are new technologies that have only emerged in the last couple of decades. Myth or fact?
Yeah, good question. Well, 77% of people voted this was a myth and 23% thought it might be a fact. This one is actually a myth. So the methods to go and grow and study living cells in the lab were actually first reported as far back as 1886. And even these really very early cell culture experiments showed that biology can be investigated without using live animals. One of the key players in developing these kinds of technologies was someone called Ross Granville Harrison at Yale University, who in 1907 successfully managed to grow fragments of frog nerve tissue in a clot of lymph. So that's kind of the first sort of major... Carla's doing a face there because that does sound gross, doesn't it? It's one of the first, one of the first recorded, experiments of this, and obviously the methods that he used have been continuously refined and improved over the years ever since. But it really laid the foundations for the cell culture techniques that we now widely use around the world. And then, of course, over the past few kind of decades, thanks to improvements in technology, upgraded equipment and availability of different products to help cells grow in this kind of unnatural lab environment. The things we can do now with growing cells in 3D, sort of mini organs called spheroids or organoids that you hear us talking about on the podcast. And we can also recreate the whole kind of complex system. Things like organ-on-a-chip technology that can really accurately replicate the human body. So, aside from using cells as well, obviously the development of computers and other technologies have really drastically improved what we can do in research. We can understand genetics and the immune system, and we're really starting now to understand complex and rare diseases as well. So, the future is going to be, bringing things like computer modelling and AI to really analyse massive amounts of data, and that's going to take us into the next kind of key era for research, which, I think is going to be personalised medicine, and it's really exciting. So, yeah, it's been a long time coming and lots of...
It's been a long time coming.
Exactly. And we're still going, but we're getting there. Starting to see things turning.
Yeah, and the tech is getting better and better all the time, as you say,
exactly.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Brilliant. So shall we bring in Isabel?
Yeah. Let's bring in Isabel. There's been absolutely loads happening with Herbie's Law over the last little while. So we thought it would be a great chance to catch up with Isabel and find out what's been going on. Isabel, tell us all about Herbie's Law.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me on again. It's great to be here. So there has been tons of momentum around Herbie's Law in recent months and weeks, which is fantastic. And one thing that we're particularly happy about is just how many mentions it's getting in Parliament at the moment. So it just keeps being mentioned again and again. And obviously this is really helpful for moving it up the political agenda and getting it onto the radar of the government, really importantly. So just a few examples of these. So there was a debate recently on a petition started by activists to end tests on dogs and other animals for the development of medicines and other products. And that saw lots of mentions of Herbie's Law. So it was actually mentioned 20 times by 10 MPs over 4 parties. So some of my colleagues worked out that this actually means that Herbie's Law was mentioned around once every 7 minutes, which is incredible. And a really key development from that as well was the government minister actually saying that they agreed with the principle of Herbie's Law. And clearly they're still a very long way away from agreeing to implement it. He then went on to say why they wouldn't be implementing it, but it still shows a really important building of momentum.
Absolutely. And it always, just on a personal level, just always brings tear to my eye, because it's really hard to get, any kind of MP engagement, let alone so many mentions. But, it's been a year today since we lost our precious Herbie. So it does really bring a tear to my eye every time I hear his name mentioned. But what a legacy, bless him.
Yeah. It's very moving, isn't it? And I think that individual animals, as well as Herbie, are often mentioned in these debates. MPs often mention their dogs and so on, and it really just helps to highlight that the animals who are used in labs are obviously all individuals.
Absolutely.
So there's been more mentions as well, which is really positive. So sadly, Herbie's law was not included in the King's speech, where all the upcoming laws were set out. We didn't expect it to be, although we had been advocating for it to be. But what was really fantastic is that there are debates following the King's speech in both the House of Commons and House of Lords. And in the House of Lords, Lord Tim Clement-Jones, who's the Lib Dem spokesperson for science, innovation and tech, and a member of the APPG, actually called on the government to introduce Herbie's law without delay in that debate on the King's speech. So that was really, really positive to hear.
Absolutely. That's quite something, isn't it? Like you say, we weren't expecting to get it in the King's speech, but to have it mentioned in the House of Lords in that context, very good. Yeah, definitely keeping the drum beating.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just with sort of every opportunity it's coming up. So, for example, there were some debates and discussions recently in both the Commons and the Lords on some sort of minor changes to the law on animal experiments, which weren't substantive in terms of changing the law, but they were basically just removing, it was an administrative piece of work, really removing references finally to EU law.
It was Brexit updates, wasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. So in the Commons debate, the minister actually proactively mentioned Herbie's law and the level of support that it has in Parliament, talking about colleagues across the House who have campaigned for something called Herbie's law, she said, which is brilliant. And then on the House of Lords debate on this same issue, again, Herbie's law was mentioned. And then again following in response from the minister. So it just keeps being raised in Parliament. Which is just so good for making sure it's on the government's agenda.
Absolutely. And tell us about the APPG then, because that's obviously the all-party parliamentary group for phasing out animal experiments is one of our kind of key ways of engaging with MPs and parliamentarians. So how's progress with that going?
Yeah, so that's continuing to go from strength to strength, and it now has 57 members, which is fantastic.
Incredible.
So well beyond the 20 members that we needed to have, and it's getting such strong support. And again, it's very regularly mentioned in debates and so on, and is really, I think, becoming a key sort of authority in Parliament on animal-free science that ministers are increasingly recognising, which is fantastic. So again, it's just a vehicle for continuing to push for much stronger action so that we can actually enable this proper transition to animal-free science where we welcome sort of the initial steps in the government strategy, but clearly it just goes absolutely nowhere near far enough to secure the kind of change we need. So it's fantastic that the APPG is able to recommend much more sort of concrete actions that are needed.
Absolutely. And obviously there's been, the big news this week is Keir Starmer has stood down as Prime Minister. So what does that mean for Herbie's law? Could we see things shift in government and, a different response to Herbie's law?
Yeah, it's a really good question, a really interesting point, and one that we're all wondering as well, of course. But from our perspective, we're just going to be pushing, really keeping up the momentum on Herbie's law. We're going to be doubling down, building our efforts as ever, so that we can do as much as we can to get this on the radar of the next Prime Minister, because we believe that Herbie's law really is the way to take forward the commitment that the government's made in its manifesto, that commitment to work towards phasing out animal testing. Well, Herbie's law is what would actually enable them to deliver that. So we're going to be making that point really clearly to the next Prime Minister.
Well, and I guess, everyone thinks that might be Andy Burnham. He likes bold action. I think he keeps saying that, doesn't he? So here you go. Here's a bold action, Andy Burnham.
Absolutely. Take note.
Yes. I'm sure he's listening and it's on his list now. So there's been some international developments over the last couple of months as well, Gemma. Can you tell us a little bit about these? Because you've been looking at them in quite a lot of detail, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you might have seen that in the past couple of weeks, the EU have published their long-awaited roadmap towards phasing out animal testing in chemical safety assessments. And there's been a lot of positive response to this, but you might be wondering sort of how does that compare to our roadmap or our strategy that was released in November last year? And also how does that fit in with other countries' strategies around this, including in America, the FDA roadmap. So the fact that these documents exist is huge in itself. Within the space of just over a year, 3 of the world's biggest, scientific and regulatory powers have all published these plans to reduce and replace animal testing. And, it's the first time we've had anything like this. It's kind of, that would have been unthinkable even a decade ago. So it's amazing, really, that this has happened. But like Isabel said, even our strategy doesn't go far enough. And it's a similar picture from what we're seeing from other countries as well. So we've been doing a bit of work to compare the 3 roadmaps and see kind of what are the priorities in each of them and what does it look like is going to happen. So if we start with our roadmap, it's called the Replacing Animals in Science Strategy, and it was released in November 2025 and covers the next 5 years. So interestingly, our strategy is actually the one that has the most wide-reaching range of all the 3 documents. So it's intended to cover the whole range of animal use in science, including for discovery and translational research, but also regulatory purposes. So it's quite ambitious compared to the other roadmaps, which have a bit more of a specific focus. And while in one way that's a really good thing because it does cover all the areas that animals are used, there's also a risk that they won't be able to deliver on everything because they have kind of tried to deliver in quite a lot of areas. But it is early days, so we're going to have to be a bit more patient before we start seeing any real change, because quite a few of the aims were from the end of this year onwards. So we'll see what happens, and they should be putting out a sort of progress timeline
progress
almost.
Report.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll be able to see where they are so far. One of the things that is really good about the UK strategy, it's the only one that actually sets specific year deadlines for replacing animals in certain types of tests. So they have a basket approach, which is basically short, medium or long-term goals. And they've put in a year that they aim to replace this with an animal-free alternative by. So there's a real deadline that they can be held accountable to. However, what we've noticed is that ones in the short-term baskets are the really easy wins. So, for example, the one in the short-term basket is the rabbit pyrogen test, which is a test where rabbits are given products like vaccines or antibiotics to see if it causes them to develop a fever. Now, this hasn't actually been carried out in British labs since 2018 because there are replacements already that are used for this. So while that does sound like a win, it wasn't actually being used anyway. So it's not going to have a big impact. And it's a similar case with some of the other ones that they've said could be short-term replacements. So things like skin and eye irritation testing of chemicals and pharmaceuticals, which is usually done in rabbits. And again, it was only done in very, very small numbers last year, and this has been gradually declining over the past decade anyway. So it's not going to have that kind of big impact that we really need to see. But a good thing in the strategy is that ours is the only one that actually mentions reducing use of dogs, which, as well as monkeys, they aim to reduce by 35% in dedicated pharmacokinetic studies for human medicine. So that's how the body processes a drug. And also by 50% for dedicated cardiovascular safety studies. So while, again, that sounds good, and, that could potentially be a big reduction, we've actually had quite an interesting time recently trying to get to the bottom of how many animals that's actually going to affect. So we've been working with MPs to ask questions to the government about, these are percentages, but how many animals were actually used for this in the first place? So how many exact animals are you expecting this to reduce if it's 50% or 35%? And they've told us
the impact on animals going to be?
Exactly. They've told us they don't actually have the baseline numbers for that. So these are almost arbitrary statistics that they've kind of put in to work towards. And that is quite shocking. So we are working with MPs to ask them follow-up questions and try to get to the bottom of how did you reach that number as an aim where you don't actually know where you're starting from. So that's not great. But we will try to get to the bottom of it.
Well, and especially coming from a government that say they won't set an overall deadline because it's arbitrary, and then they've set these interim ones which are just as arbitrary and they can't even measure.
That's it, exactly. So, yeah, that was a little bit strange, but we're really hoping that there is going to be something to back that up, because obviously that is a really key area, using dogs and monkeys. That's really not what we want to be seeing. So that's a really important area. But one other thing to point out about our strategy is it's the only one that actually looks at the role of scientific journals, and it includes commitments to encourage journal editors to publish more research using animal-free methods. So while that might sound a little bit niche and, a kind of minor point, it does actually influence what scientists choose to work on, because they look at what's published in these journals, and it could actually really help new technologies be adopted. So this could be a really key piece of the puzzle to help change happen more quickly. And there's a lot more in... Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say on that one that sometimes scientists are saying that they're being, sort of required to do animal tests so that they can get published in journals, which doesn't really sound like it's in, lockstep with the current law. They shouldn't be doing that.
Exactly. It's a really important issue, because, you could submit a really brilliant piece of work that doesn't include any animal research, but then that journal could come back and say, well, I want to see some animal research to back this up. And, quite often people will go away and just do that to satisfy that journal's request, which obviously isn't how it should be if your animal-free research is, at that standard on its own. So that's really important.
And I don't think that's what the animal experiment kind of regulations intend either.
No,
so yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So we'll be really interested to see what comes out of that. But there's a lot more in our strategy, and you can listen back to our strategy special that we actually recorded back in November when it first came out if you do want to learn a bit more about it. But in the interest of time, let's have a quick look at the other ones. So let's move on to the USA's FDA roadmap to reducing animal testing in preclinical safety studies, which was published back in April 2025, which is supposed to cover the next 3 years. So they're a little bit further ahead than us, and they've actually already published their first year impact report, where they've made some really good statements about the things that they've managed to achieve and what they're going to do next. But the main focus of their roadmap is slightly different to ours. So it's all about reducing animal testing specifically in preclinical safety studies. And they are really looking to replace animals with alternatives like organ on a chip, computer modelling, advanced cell methods, and there's also a big focus on AI. So it is a little bit more focused than our strategy, and it doesn't cover the areas of basic or translational research, which is, the research that's done in universities or by companies, where in the UK at least, a large proportion of the animal use actually does take place. But the language they use leaves everything quite open, so they could expand what they're doing to include this at a later date. But one of the main focuses of the roadmap is reducing the use of monkeys, specifically in preclinical safety testing of monoclonal antibody treatments, which are a type of targeted immunotherapy treatment for diseases like cancer. And they will then aim to expand that to other types of treatment and also chemicals in the future. But the reason they've chosen to start there is because their regulatory requirements ask for repeat dose toxicity studies lasting up to 6 months. And there's well-known problems with this because animal immune systems are very different to humans. So, doing these tests doesn't actually mean that that drug will be safe for people. But they've put in their report that these programs on average use about 144 monkeys just to test one drug. So not only is there an ethical incentive that way, there's also a financial one, because these tests can cost up to $50,000 per monkey. So obviously there's a big financial incentive there as well. So all of this, it does sound really good, and they make a lot of positive statements in their first year update report. But again, there's still a lot of things missing from their roadmap as well, including this overall commitment to end all animal tests by a certain date, but also a commitment to make changes to legislation, which they said they will do if needed, and also to make changes to include other animals outside from monkeys. But they've left it quite open, so they could expand this in future years. So we'll be seeing what they do with that in future.
So their approach then is very specific. It's very kind of niched down, quite granular, one thing at a time. Whereas the UK's approach has gone for, well, we'll do our best with everything. It's quite different, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
But with both of them, and I guess you're going to come on to say this, so sorry if I'm preempting you,
No,
Gemma.
you
With both the UK and the US ones, we don't have any commitment in law, do we? So if the Trump administration changes, that could all go out of the window. And, you know, if our new Prime Minister doesn't really fancy the strategy, I mean, it's a manifesto commitment, so they'd be hard pushed, I think, Isabel, that's correct, isn't it? They'd be hard pushed to kind of revoke it, but certainly another government could.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why it's so important that we do actually have legislation and hence Herbie's law, because you're absolutely right that while we have the current government in place, there is the manifesto commitment, of course, that still stands. But clearly that may not stand in future, whereas if we manage to get something in law, it will be there on the statute books.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So, Gemma, tell us about the EU roadmap then.
Yeah, so moving on to this one, like I said, it's come out in the past couple of weeks, and the EU roadmap is called the Roadmap Towards Phasing Out Animal Testing for Chemical Safety Assessments. So the clue is in the name with this one. It is slightly different and it only covers chemical regulation, but that is still a massive area, and it covers about 15 different topics, including testing of industrial chemicals, things like pesticides and biocides, but also things like medical device biocompatibility and chemical pharmaceuticals. So that is a certain type of drug where they have a defined chemical structure, something like paracetamol, for example, and that is slightly different to what the FDA are doing, where they're focusing on monoclonal antibodies. So these are slightly different things that would be covered. But it's still a really important area because according to their report, between 2015 and 2023, over 15 million animals were used for regulatory testing in the EU, with almost 40% of those for these chemical safety assessments. So really big numbers of animals. And the roadmap sets out about 22 actions which support the validation, standardisation and qualification of non-animal approaches. So they're really looking to, really robustly test these alternatives and really make sure that they stand up so that they can be accepted to replace these kind of animal tests. But this has been a long time coming, this roadmap, and the EU already has a lot of infrastructure in place. So things like they have a validation centre already set up that unfortunately we lost access to after Brexit. So we're now trying to establish our own as part of our strategy. So some of the first steps that they're taking is to actually take stock of where they currently are. So what resources do they already have? What are their training needs? What are the regulatory needs? And then they're going to address the areas that they find through that research and move forward. So there'll be a lot of extra information coming out about this in the future, I would have thought. But they do also list some specific tests that they're going to be prioritising replacements for, a bit like our 3 buckets strategy. But unlike ours, they don't make specific year commitments to replacements. They are instead just having short, medium and long-term goals. And they also specifically mention tests that use fish. So fish are used in the hundreds of thousands for chemical tests, even though a lot of other animals are used to test these types of chemicals too. But they do mention that the long-term goal of their strategy is to replace all animals, including those that don't actually have protection under the law, things like embryos and invertebrates. But one of the really key things in the EU roadmap that is missing from both the UK and the US documents is that they do make a commitment to set these changes into legislation by the end of 2029. But that in itself has pulled some criticism from some people saying that because of the really complex layers of legislation in the EU, these kind of small changes might actually get superseded by other pieces of legislation. So it's all a bit complicated, but it's a really good commitment that that's in there in the first place. So, yeah, I could talk about this all day. There's so many examples of things that are different and things that are similar. They all, have different focuses, as I've explained. But one of the really key things is they do make international collaboration a priority, which is going to be really important because we don't want to be duplicating work. It will lead to wasted time, wasted resources, and in the meantime, animal lives as well. So we do need to make sure that we get to a point where if one country does validate an animal-free technology, that is then accepted by the other countries, because that is the way to really streamline everything. And also a really important point to make is that at the moment we're doing regulatory experiments in British labs to satisfy requirements from other countries that we're not even asking for ourselves. So, clearly there's a disconnect there that can be changed by us all working really closely together. So I think overall this is really good news, and it's amazing to see these 3 documents published so closely together, and it feels like things are starting to change. But none of them go far enough, and the really key part that is missing from every country's roadmap or strategy is that there is no commitment to a complete date where all animal experiments will end. So like Isabel says, that's why we're going to keep pressing our government to make sure that the UK strategy goes further and does implement Herbie's law, which will set a timeline and give us something to work towards.
Gemma, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, because it's quite confusing. They're all quite different, although there's the similarities. So thank you so much for kind of like shedding some light on this kind of like confusing world. You're an absolute star. Thank you. Well, thank you so much to everybody who took part in World Animal Free Research Day. We launched our new shop, so thank you everyone who bought a t-shirt or something from our shop. That's been fantastic to see so many people wanting to kind of spread the word through merchandise. We had lots of celebrities kind of get involved. So Pete Wicks, Will Young, our lovely patron Carol Royal, Kirsty Gallagher, who you heard last time on the podcast, Pandora Christie, and legendary photographer Rankin all got involved. And we had lots of engagement from parliamentarians sharing about World Animal Free Research Day on their socials. So really great kind of community effort and really raised the profile of everything. So thank you. We cannot do any of this without you. Well, that's all we've got time for in this episode, but we're going to be back in July. We'll have an update on the latest statistics on animal use in British laboratories and all the latest, as you would expect, from the heart of animal-free research. But before we go, Gemma, what is this week's myth or fact? And I promise not to sing it, so I won't.
I was waiting for it then. This week's question is: a change in Prime Minister could mean a change to the government's strategy to phase out animal testing. Myth or fact? So that's a change in Prime Minister could mean a change to the government strategy to replace out animal testing. Myth or fact? So you can vote on our website. You'll find the link in our podcast email or the links on our social media. And we'll also discuss the results in the next episode. But if you'd like to get in touch about anything else or have any questions, please do drop us an email at hello@animalfreeresearchuk, and we might feature your comments in a future episode.
And I think the eagle-eared, if that's the thing, of you, an eagle-eared of you, might have heard the answer to that in the episode. So,
yeah, let us know what you think.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Isabel, for joining us today and giving us an update on Herbie's Law, and Gemma for your amazing overview of all of these roadmaps. We'll see you in a few weeks. Thanks so much for listening. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye.